So very soon, you're going to get a chance to use a whole bunch of different SAS functions. You're going to get to actually type out the different SAS functions and see how they work. But before we even do that, let's discuss what functions are and how they work. Let's first start with a definition. A function is a component of the SAS programming language that can accept arguments, perform a computation or other operation, and return a value. So let me show you with an example what arguments are. I'm going to create a variable here that is called SumThis, and then I'm going to make it equal to the sum function, and then when I open the parentheses, I can put in what are called arguments. So let me put in 3 arguments. I'm going to put in the number 7, and each of your arguments has to be separated by a comma. So after I put in that number, I'll do a comma, I'll put in a 9, and then I'll take a comma, and I'll put in my final number 13. And then of course, we're going to close the parentheses, and then the semicolon. Now the sum function requires at least one argument. That argument can be a variable, it can be a numeric constant, or an expression. Let me quickly show you an example of each of those arguments being utilized in the sum function. You could even add a variable list just like this. So when you're looking at new functions, first take a look at what it does. In the case of the sum function, it takes a bunch of numbers and adds them together, or takes the variables and adds the different values of the variables. Consider then if the function has any arguments, and if it does, how many of them are required and how many are optional. Let me give you an example of a function that takes no arguments. So I'll go ahead and create a new variable, equals, and then I'll type today. So this is the today function, and then I'm going to use the opening parentheses, and then I'm going to close the parentheses, and then the semicolon. Notice there's nothing in between those parentheses because we don't have to supply any arguments. The today function will return today's date to us without the need for any arguments. The final thing that you want to take note of as it relates to arguments is what kind of arguments can this function take if it does take any types of arguments. So as an example, does it take in a string? Does it take in a numeric constant? Does it take in an expression? You want to know this stuff, because if the first required argument only takes in a string, you want to make sure that you're putting in a string there, or it's not going to work. Or maybe it takes in only a numeric constant as its first argument. So be wary of that. Now, returning to the definition of what a function is, remember that the definition also talked about functions performing a computation or other operation. While the sum function is a good example of a function performing a computation, when it comes to other operations, you're going to see an example of that in just a bit when I talk about the scan function. And finally, the definition talks about a function being able to return a value. And this simply means that we can save the result, the resulting value if you will, of whatever the function does. We can save that inside of a variable. And what that ultimately means is that different functions can interact with each other. If we can save the result or the value of one function in one variable, and we can do the same thing for another function in another variable, these two can talk to each other or interact. We can layer one function on top of another. Now, while this course is focused on the SAS programming itself, I do want to give you some use cases. That is, how are these functions actually used in the world to do important stuff? Now, one of the first competitions that I entered online had to do with the Titanic. And the goal was, could we predict which passengers survived and which died? So then we were given this data set with a whole bunch of variables or features. We had to work with that data set. We had to train it. And then we had to see if we were able to predict the right outcome. Now, one technique that is really useful often in machine learning is to look at a current variable, look at the format of it, and then consider if changing that format, if changing how that variable is represented would help you make a prediction. In this case, if somebody was going to survive the Titanic or if they were going to die. Now, early on, I of course looked at the data set and I realized something. The names had prefixes, so sometimes Mr., Mrs., Miss, and in other cases titles such as DR for doctor. So what I decided to do was to create individual columns or variables out of the prefixes and also from the titles. To do that, we have to use a function. In SAS, the function that we need to use is the scan function. Here's an example of a really simple data set, and we just have a variable that's called name, and we go ahead and create a new variable that's called prefix. Prefix equals scan, so that is the name of the function, and then opening parentheses, we put in the name of the variable, that is its first argument, comma, 1 is which word do we want to take out for this new variable called prefix. Do we want to take out the MR? Do we want to take out the Ermin part? Do we want to take out the last name? In our case, we want to take out the Mr. and the doctor, so we put it in a 1. If we wanted the Ermin, we would put in, or the Joanna, we would put in the number 2, and if we wanted the last names, we would put in a 3. The scan function has two required arguments. The first is the string, which can be a character constant, a variable, as is the case in our situation, or an expression. It also has a count required argument, which is the 1, 2, or 3 in our case, and this indicates which word we want to pick out. So imagine my excitement when I realized that this new variable that I created, the prefixes, was actually really predictive of who survived and who died in the Titanic. So functions allow you to perform these certain tasks, transform your data, represent your variables in a different way, create new variables out of the variables that you currently have, and all of this cool stuff. So I hope you really found that valuable. Coming up, you're going to learn how to perform these SAS functions using actual SAS code. Have fun.